haven't had an audience this big. We won't try to get that. I'm hugely proud to be hosting this event today on Truth, Democracy and Freedom, the post-pandemic results, surrounded by an expert panel who will present to you for about 10 minutes each. I've spoken with all of them at different venues around the world over the last 12 months. And given the fact that no one really wants to listen to what I've got to say in the House of Commons, I think we'd better get on with them as fast as possible. I would tell you that as Winston Churchill wrote in his war memoirs, the truth is uncontrovertible. Panic may resist it, ignorance may deride it, malice may distort it, but there it is. And that's what you're going to be hearing today. So please, if you put your hands together for Dr. David E. Martin, who's going to give the first presentation to.
In the interest of time, I'll see if I can cut it even shorter than my address to the European Union Parliament, which was about half of the time I was supposed to have. First of all, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, members of Parliament. And thank you all for being here today. My job is a very simple one. It's to set the stage for the context of how this came about. And I thought that it was only appropriate to use the Treason Act of 1351 here in the UK as the grounds for starting this conversation. Because we have long lost the idea of what it means to have public accountability. And as such, I thought it would be appropriate to make sure that we recall that back then, sleeping with a queen consort was a problem, and doing these various things that with threat to the crown were a problem. But somehow or another, since 1351, we've lost the idea that a full-on assault on liberty at every level is somehow acceptable. So I thought we'd at least start with the spirit of 1351 in the room as we move to the next slide. My job here is not to convince you of a thing. My job here is to merely present the context that says that there is no question that the entirety of what we've been through over the last 4 years has been merely an orchestration to assault the liberties of people here in this country and around the world. Pretending that this is some sort of public health emergency, pretending this is a justification for the inconceivable threat to liberties and the violation of human rights, is actually nothing more than to give lip service to tyrants. And the fact of the matter is, the evidence starts here in the UK in 1966. Your own Wellcome Trust was the one who decided to fund coronavirus as the preferred form of human manipulation in 1966. It was 1 year later that the United States and the UK got into an agreement that said that we were going to modify and manipulate coronavirus to see what could be done to infect, quote, a healthy population, end quote. That was 1967, the year of my birth. So this slow-moving train wreck that we call Operation Warp Speed only took 56 short years to come into being. And in 2011, in the document that is imaged on the left, which unfortunately, given the size of the screen, is pretty much illegible, but you can go find it, an antitrust collusion, and I'm using that term quite literally, between the Wellcome Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, NIAID, and the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention got together and established a mandate that said that by 2020, the world would accept, and I quote, a universal vaccine, end quote, by the end of 2020. Now, these folks apparently have a dividing rod or some sort of mysterious bubble that they can look into to see the future with such absolute elegance. They actually identified back then that coronavirus might be the thing that would be just what nature needed to order for that to happen. And by 2015, we had the public statement, and I need to read this into the record. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, we need to increase the public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures, such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. Let me pause for a moment. When this statement was made, the World Health Organization had officially declared coronavirus an eradicated disease. In what world do we need a vaccine for a disease that the World Health Organization, in its own infinite wisdom, has declared eradicated. Question, just sit on that for a moment. But let's go on. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Does that sound like a public health emergency to you? Or does that sound like a statement of treason? That is an act of domestic and international terrorism, and that's the admission of that act. And just in a few short days, we will have the author of that statement, one Peter Dashing, testifying in Congress that this thing probably still came out of a random event that took place in Wuhan, China, where a bat and a pangolin got together, and voila, in December, we were there. That's a quote from 2015 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's the conspiracy level language I'm using. And by the way, I'm using the term conspiracy in the legal definition of the term. This is the admission of conspiracy to commit acts of terror. And 1 year later, the last image you see on this screen, 1 year later, was the announcement, and I'm quoting, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1 was, and I quote, poised for human emergence. End quote. That was 2016. That's the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. That's the conspiracy that I'm apparently representing. Next slide. Now, the evidence for all of you who doubt the merits of the argument that I'm making is right in front of you. In 2002, the upper left, you see the first patent in 2002 filed on the synthetic chimeric coronavirus, which, as I've said in many instances, was actually patented to be infectious and replication defective. What that means is it was actually weaponized. That's not an allegation, that's a statement of fact, because in 2005, you see at the bottom of the curriculum vitae of one Ralph Baird, line 57, I believe that is, of his bio, says, synthetic coronaviruses, biohacking, biological warfare enabling technologies. Does anyone actually want to just muse for a moment what he could have potentially meant when he said biological warfare enabling technology? Does that sound like a public health response? Does that sound like a P3 program where we're trying to figure out how to treat this thing? Is that what it sounds like? Or is there outside chance that the reason why he unleashed $10 million that year and every other year in non-competitive grants from all of the above referenced agencies, is there any chance that the reason why is because they were actually building, are you ready for this? Biological weapons. Now, I happen to have the credential in the United States since 2002 of being a biological weapons inspector. I know of what I speak. And the fact of the matter is, I briefed this matter first in 2002. I consistently briefed this ever since. And when in 2019, September 18th, 2019, we actually had the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness Monitoring Board announce that there was going to be, in the time between September 19th, 2019, and September of 2020, there was going to be, are you ready for this, an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. There's an operative word in that statement that's quite alarming, isn't there? Release. That's not a leak. That's not an accidental escape. They used the word release. They didn't use there might be an accident. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to have to jump past this because I'm almost out of time, and I said I would stick to 9 minutes, so I'm going to jump past this one. And unfortunately, I'll only reference this by saying that the criminal conspiracy, which must be criminally prosecuted in this country, not alleged, but prosecuted, is the racketeering that has been the World Health Organization's collusion since the MRC in this country was founded by the Wellcome Trust. And since in the United States, the Rockefeller Foundation functionally funded what we now call the CDC, which back then was the Malaria Prevention Program. But we must actually deal with the fact that this antitrust collusion actually did not start in the last few years. It started in 1955, and why is this important? It's important because under the UN Charter that established the World Health Organization, we cannot even indict or investigate crimes committed by the World Health Organization but there is no statute of limitations on these crimes. These are crimes that have no statute of limitation, and we can actually predate the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the Rockefeller Foundation's criminal collusion with prosecuting the crimes when they were actually committed. It was fraud then, it's fraud now, resulting in the murder of civilization around the world. Last slide. Almost last slide. I can't help but sit in this chamber and point out that none other than Eliza Manningham, who was the head of the Wellcome Trust Board of Trustees, who happened at the same time to be the head of MI5, was the one who sat at the helm of COVID when the September 19th launch of this campaign began. You cannot escape the fact that MI5 was directly involved in the premeditation and distribution of this particular campaign of terror. And I know that as an American, it's probably a bad idea for me to say that in this audience, and I could care less. The fact of the matter is, criminals exist in every strata of this government, and we need to actually be able to point that out. And I figured, why not go ahead and put the poster right up there so everybody can see it. I'm only 9 seconds away from my last bit. Last slide. This is the last slide. Many people ask me why. And let's stop pretending that we have to ask a question of why. That's a nonsense question. In the 1980s, we conveniently had the HIV pandemic so that we could actually justify the National Childhood Vaccine Immunity Shield that was granted to the injection manufacturers at the time. Because the fact of the matter was the public was willing to go along with it because they all knew AIDS was coming for them. We tried to get that immunity long before, but once we had the HIV scare, we could get the public to say, yep, immunity for the manufacturers because we know we're going to need it. September of 2001, we all pretend that we know what happened with the towers on the 11th, but we all forget what happened on the 28th, which is when the Defense Department, from their bioweapons program, released anthrax. And 4 short years later, we had the PrEP Act. Why? Because in 1991, we were killing people with anthrax vaccines in the Gulf. And we needed to come up with a way to get the adult provisions protection into adult injections because the Childhood Act didn't give them the cover that they needed. And so 4 short years later, we have the PrEP Act, which gives us medical countermeasures, and it gives us corporate immunity. So guess what SARS is? Nothing more than the 4-year later, see a pattern? Preamble to the World Health Organization's IHR. Don't pretend like you don't know. This was a setup from the beginning to the end, and ladies and gentlemen, I yield the balance to everybody else, but I think since you brought up the lovely Churchill, I should go ahead and take that quote. Never let a good crisis go to waste. This is all a marketing cover story to deprive you of liberty, and I'm here to make sure that as long as I draw breath, I'm fighting to get it back. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, David, and I now call on Dr. Pierre Corey to give.
They call it the Californication